Hello everyone and welcome to the second installment of Short Stories. I've only got 3 for you this week, but they're a little longer than last time, so I think it'll make up for it. Once again from Unrested Jade and her request party after finishing Flowey is Not a Good Life Coach. It's been long enough since I did one of these, so let's jump right in here. The first story comes from Aeromax on Tumblr. They wanted a game of Clue being played by Rodimus Prime, Ganondorf, and a surprise guest. What could possibly go wrong? Does anyone else have any candlesticks? Papyrus asked, looking over his cards. Rodimus sighed.
That's the wrong game. For the last time, we're playing Clue. And stop telling us what cards you have.
He struggled to hold his own cards, delicately pinching them between his fingertips. He had no idea how he was going to move his Little Miss Scarlet token on the board without breaking it. He'd forgotten how small humans were. Oh, right. Papyrus held his cards a little closer. Sorry, Mr. Captain Sexy Robot.
Yes, well,
Rodimus said, puffing up a bit.
No harm done, small humanoid.
He liked it when people remembered the captain bit. And the rest of the epithet wasn't too shabby either. If someone was going to forget his name, there were worse things to be called. He squinted, struggling to read the tiny print on the instructions.
Whoever's to the left of me goes next, which would be you,
he said, gesturing to the larger humanoid. Ganondorf chucked the die across the board with a huff of annoyance.
This is asinine.
He didn't even bother to move his token.
It was Mrs. Peacock in the dining room with the dagger. It's the first round, human,
Rodimus snapped.
You can't have guessed it already.
Counter it then, Ganondorf said, resting his chin on one hand.
Between the Stalfos giving his hand away and you dropping your cards multiple times, it was easy enough to work out.
Papyrus shrugged and set his cards aside. Well, that was a quick game. He busied himself with braiding a lock of Ganondorf's hair while Rodimus carefully reshuffled the cards. Best 2 out of 3. I have a feeling I'm actually very good at this game.
Well, at least you're not cheating, unlike some people.
Rodimus dealt the cards again, glaring in Ganondorf's direction.
Do it right this time.
Meanwhile, the actual, literally completely normal vacuum cleaner that served as their 4th player sat motionless on its side of the board. That thing, Papyrus said, scooting closer to the large Gerudo sitting beside him, is really starting to give me the heebie-jeebies. Does anyone remember getting it out of the closet? The others shook their heads, gazes drawn to the vacuum. It was perfectly still, as inanimate objects tend to be. Something about it radiated a dark foreboding. Rodimus shuffled a bit closer to his companions as well.
One of us should put it away. I mean, it's not like it can play, even.
No one volunteered. Okay, not gonna lie, I hadn't read this all the way through before I started recording, and when I hit the vacuum line, I just kinda had to stop and stare at it for a minute. Okay, next up, another snippet from Flowey is Not a Good Life Coach. So spoiler alert if you haven't gotten through chapter 22. This is your last chance to click away, you have been warned. 3, 2, 1... This one comes from Baby Charmander, who wants to know what troubling thoughts Flowey was experiencing before he truly went to the dark side. They wouldn't leave him alone. The thoughts. After so many repetitions of the same events, so many trips around the wheel, Flowey was finding it more and more difficult to stay patient, to stay kind, to think of his friends as real living people. They were like dolls of a sort. The lack of emotions left him empty and dull. But even if he had his soul intact, he suspected that this slow degradation of his better nature would have happened regardless. The problem wasn't emotional numbness, not really. It was boredom. The same asinine conversations, the same asinine problems, with the same asinine solutions, the same asinine endings. Endlessly, forever. It was grating on him, flaying his sanity. Everyone was stuck on the loop, except him. He wasn't stuck like they were. He could choose what he said and did, try different things, have as many do-overs as he wanted, without price or penalty. Why not? The realization that he really could do whatever he wanted was horrendous. He still knew right from wrong, though, even if he couldn't feel emotions of guilt or shame. He could resist.
Why?
And he did, for a long time. He kept his thoughts to himself as his friends and family played out the same stupid, selfish farce that had passed for their lives over and over. There was literally nothing better to do.
Though there could be.
By ignoring one or more of them on this go-round, or leaving them to work out their own issues on that go-round, he could eke out a modicum of variation. Nothing substantial, nothing that didn't whet his appetite further, lend volume to the voice whispering to the back of his mind that he could do anything.
Anything at all.
Anything he wanted. He'd always suspected that he was a bad person, the way anxious children often do.
Bad children get turned into flowers to atone for their sins.
Bad or not, he still had self-control. He wouldn't hurt anyone.
Not really.
Maybe he could just censor himself less. Go off script. For the sake of his sanity, something had to happen. If he indulged a little, in a peaceful way, perhaps that would be enough of a change to make the thoughts stop.
Perhaps.
Flowey decided to try being honest. He wasn't out to torment anyone, of course.
Of course.
He was simply speaking his mind. It was like therapy, a sort of stream of consciousness mental bloodletting. Just a mild catharsis. It would help.
He couldn't help himself.
At the beginning, in the courtyard with all the happy yellow flowers.
If you'd been smart or brave enough to use Kara's soul yourself, Dad, maybe this wouldn't have happened.
Out in the ruins, rustling amongst the fallen leaves.
Wow, Mom, you sure have all the answers figured out while you cower here in the ruins, huh?
In a place that was bitter cold, where his #1 fan lived.
You really are a total joke. Did you realize? Funny, I guess the punchline is that everyone sees it but you.
Farther along, where the damp and mildew pervaded everything.
Everyone thinks you're so brave, but we know better, huh? You're more afraid than anyone else down here.
Outside the locked door of a house that was often walked by, but never entered.
Change as much as you want, but you're still you. You're still alone, and you deserve it.
Down with a dear friend, where a deeper darkness waited like an open mouth.
Are you ever gonna do it, or are you just gonna stand there forever?
It helped, a bit. In a flat, twisting discomfort, Flowey watched the little dramas shift off their rails. It was something different. The thoughts eased, the voice faded to the softest murmur.
That wasn't so bad.
It wouldn't last. Already the novelty was beginning to fade, and the specter of escalation loomed on the horizon. But it was on the horizon for now. And despite the consequences to his dear friends, temporary consequences, harm that they wouldn't recall, and so could it really be considered harm at all? And that he could easily undo, he persisted. Persisting was all he could do, after all. Forever. It was his thing. He might as well keep himself mentally whole, right? What good did it do to suffer? Surely his real pain was worse than any transient pain they, the dolls, felt. Yes, he had himself under control. Finally. Worth it. The key was to know when to bend. Just a little more. That was fun to read. Something about Flowey, man. You gotta hate him, but you gotta feel bad for him, too. Okay, and this last one is a little bit long for these little fics, but it's a really interesting one that I wanted to read. It comes from Ian, or Ian, I'm not really sure how to say your name. A terrorist sans or Papyrus. Frisk landed hard, rolling across the pavement and sliding to a halt against a shop front. Their backpack kept them from cracking their head against the brick wall. The world was soundless save for a high-pitched ringing. Frisk rubbed at a tickle in their ear. Their hand came away sticky with blood. They peered at the red smear, confused. It was hard to focus their eyes. What happened? After a moment spent watching the panicked crowd scatter among the rubble that until a few seconds ago had been a metro station, Frisk's brain supplied the answer. A bomb. A bomb had gone off in the metro station. A lone figure moved calmly, deliberately amongst the rubble. Vision doubled in struggling to keep their eyes open. Frisk made out the combat fatigues. Sunlight filtering through the dust hanging in the air gleamed off white bone. A monster, one from the underground. The skeleton monster straightened, and Frisk's heart jumped into their throat. It had spotted them. They shut their eyes, did their best to play dead, but it was too late. They could hear quick footsteps crunching over the scattered cement. Oh no, oh no, oh no! Frisk burst into motion, lurching to their feet and running. A hand scraped against their backpack but slipped off. Hey! Adrenaline didn't take Frisk very far. Blood running into their eyes and dizzy, they rolled their ankle on some loose debris and dropped. The world twisted to the side, fading. The last thing they saw was the skeleton monster's boots as it caught up with them. Someone was humming tunelessly. It was a little annoying. Frisk returned to consciousness reluctantly. Their head hurt. Their everything hurt, in fact. And they were cold. And someone was carrying them. A paramedic? A cop? Who had shown up to scare the bomber away? Frisk blinked their eyes open, expecting bright sunlight but finding darkness. They were in a tunnel of some kind. Not a metro tunnel, but something deeper and older. They could just make out the bricks that made up the tunnel walls, irregular and mold slick. They might have been centuries old. The only illumination was a flashlight strapped to their savior's shoulder. Even without the Delta rune embroidered on the breast of the uniform and on the jaunty beret, the bony face was pretty hard to miss. The skeleton cocked his head to look down at them. "Oh, hello! You're awake!" Intending to kick and punch and flail their way to freedom, and presumably come up with an escape plan on the way to the floor, Frisk found they were too weak and injured to manage more than some pathetic dying fish flopping. The skeleton tightened his grip to keep Frisk from falling. "Whoa there, human! I don't think you can walk quite yet. You were leaking quite a lot, you know." Worn out by their brief struggle, Frisk went still. Had the skeletons stopped their bleeding? What was the point of attacking people and then giving them first aid? Whatever the reason, Frisk refused to feel even a little grateful to the monster who'd hurt them in the first place. Gee, I wonder why, they signed, hands sluggish and clumsy. Probably because you were too close to the blast, the skeleton said, matter-of-factly. Frisk grunted. No duh, genius. Did he not even feel bad about what he'd done? Their eyes widened in sudden panic. You can sign? Maybe they shouldn't have sassed the magic-wielding terrorist. Frisk wasn't used to strangers being able to understand what they were saying. The skeleton nodded. Well, not right at this moment because I'm holding you, but otherwise, yes. Frisk considered whether they should apologize for being rude, and if that would do them any good, but the skeleton's attention shifted away from them to the plain steel door set in the wall of the tunnel. Password, a disinterested voice said. The skeleton snapped to attention as best he could with a child in his arms. Swordfish! There was a clack of a heavy lock disengaging, and the door swung inward. You don't need to say it so loud, bro. Another skeleton, this one shorter and broader, ushered him inside. The entryway to the underground base, and Frisk didn't know what else this place would be, was as dilapidated and mildewed as the tunnels inside. At least there were a few fluorescent lights to see by. The sentry stiffened when he caught sight of Frisk. Papyrus, what is that? The door shut and locked again with a heavy thud. Nothing. The skeleton, Papyrus apparently, clutched Frisk tighter, turning away and walking briskly down the dimly lit corridor. Absolutely nothing, brother, so just... Frisk was jostled as the sentry skeleton grabbed Papyrus's arm. You brought a human here? The sentry clutched his own skull, frantic. What were you thinking? Undyne is gonna kill you! Pfah! Papyrus shrugged, jostling Frisk again. Ugh, that didn't feel good. No, she won't. His grin slipped as he shuffled uncertainly. At least I'm pretty sure she won't. Look, he said. They're hurt. So? Well, I couldn't just leave them on the street, Sans. Papyrus looked down at Frisk with a concerned frown. Sans didn't seem impressed. That's exactly what you should have done, Pap. He stared at Frisk, as though daring them to try to say anything funny. Frisk squirmed. Despite looking a little dumpy, Sans was more intimidating than Papyrus. Sans shook his head, looking back to Frisk's captor. You're gonna get hurt if you keep up with that Florence Nightingale routine. Papyrus said nothing in reply. Frisk didn't know how someone could do puppy dog eyes without any eyes, but he was definitely pulling it off. Leaning back against the wall, Sans scrubbed one hand down his face and sighed in defeat. What are you gonna do, hide it in our bunk? Bro, come on, be rational. If Undyne finds out that you... If I find out what? A shadow fell over the trio. Frisk heard bones rattle as the skeletons flinched. A tall, wiry fish monster stood before them in the hallway. Frisk shivered as one yellow eye fell on them, slit pupil narrowing. She stiffened, and Frisk could hear the sharp intake of breath. Undyne, Papyrus stammered. Fancy meeting you here. Nice day, isn't it? Sans moved subtly to put himself between this Undyne and his... brother? Had Frisk caught that right? This added an effect of shielding Frisk, which was fine. The skeletons were scary, but the fish monster felt downright dangerous. Somehow, though, they doubted the sentry would be much help. You two, Undyne hissed, yellow eye never leaving Frisk's face. In the Situation Room. Now. The Situation Room was as grubby and badly lit as everything else Frisk had seen so far, and held only a scuffed metal table and some equally battered folding chairs. Once they were all inside and the door locked behind them, Undyne turned on Papyrus, arms outstretched. "Give it to me." Frisk whimpered as Papyrus squeezed too tight. He shook his head. Sans nudged Papyrus's side, glancing from him to Frisk. "Bro," he warned. He glared at Frisk for a moment, as though it were their fault they were down here. No one ever wanted Frisk around, not even as a terrorist's hostage, apparently. Real nice. Like Frisk was so excited to be a prisoner. Jerk. "Papyrus, we don't have time to argue about this," Undyne said, making a gimme gesture with her hand. "Don't you remember what happened to the Kiev cell when they took a human hostage?" Kiev? Hadn't that been in the news a few months ago? Hesitantly, Frisk signed, "The Kiev underground is gone." "That's right, buddy." Sans raised a brow. "The humans bombed half the city to make sure they wiped out the cell before they could take their hostage's soul. Took out a lot of their own civilians to do it, too. And the hostage, of course." Frisk did not like the look he was giving them. Yeah, a real jerk. The glint in Undyne's eye was even worse. "That's right," she said. "So we need to work fast. Hand it over, Papyrus." She reached out, claws brushing over Frisk's sleeve. "No!" Papyrus snapped, more forcefully than Frisk had expected. He took a step back. "They're not hurting anyone. Besides," he said, "no one saw me pick them up. Everyone had run away." For a moment, Frisk was sure Undyne would take them from her underling by force, but after a brief stare down, the fish monster sat heavily in one of the chairs, leaning her chin on her hand. She blew a long sigh from her gills, looking slightly less scary and a lot more tired. "Oh, Paps, what am I gonna do with you?" "Sorry, Commander." Papyrus looked honestly upset, fidgeting under Undyne's weary stare. Weird to think that the "I'm not mad, just disappointed" shtick worked on terrorists, too. Weren't his arms getting tired by now? Frisk wriggled in his grip. Their foot was falling asleep and they had a crick in their neck. Catching on to Frisk's discomfort, Papyrus set them down in a chair, draping his uniform jacket around them. Frisk pulled it around themselves gratefully. It was cold and damp down here. Papyrus sat down next to them, prodding at them gently. Frisk cringed and whimpered when he dug into a sore spot in their side. A warm, tingling feeling started where his hand had pressed to their ribs, and Frisk realized he was healing them. His brother and Undyne watched him work, visibly unhappy. "When I tell you to take care of any wounded you find," Undyne said, "you know this isn't what I mean, right?" Frisk saw Papyrus frown, but he pretended not to hear his commander's criticism. Sans muttered something in bitter tones Frisk couldn't catch. "I also notice," Undyne went on, "that the bomb went off almost an hour late. Totally missed rush hour." She steepled her fingers, leaning forward. "Run into some trouble on the surface?" "Yes," Papyrus said blithely. He didn't look up from his task. Frisk's side only ached a little now. "Papyrus?" Undyne's voice held a warning rumble. Frisk shuddered. "You realize they outnumber us 10-1. Frisk held out their arm when Papyrus gestured for it. They watched as he closed up a cut on the back of their hand, the skin pulling back together with that same warm, tingling feeling. I took out the station just like you said. Frisk frowned, thinking back to the last several weeks of news reports. A lot more of the recent attacks in the city had suffered no casualties, only property damage. Were they all Papyrus's doing? What kind of terrorist went out of their way to avoid hurting people? Wasn't that kind of backward? Undine's lips curled around her very large and sharp-looking yellow teeth. Sans was sitting on her eye patch side. She twisted her head to shoot an imploring look at him. Don't even, boss. Sans crossed his arms and shook his head. I begged you to keep him out of the field, didn't I? I'm sitting right here, Papyrus grumbled. Sans turned his attention to his brother. And you don't listen either. That thing, he said, stabbing a finger in Frisk's direction, could have killed you. You shouldn't have even been there when the bomb went off. Frisk squirmed as Undine's gaze fell on them again. She pushed away from the table and stood, too anxious or angry to sit still. He's right, Paps. This isn't the first time you've gotten creative with my orders. She paced, clenching and unclenching her fists. And now you bring a live human into the base without a word to me or anyone else? I can't ignore this. Was she going to try to take Frisk away again? Frisk had a feeling that Undine had a one-way trip in mind for them that didn't involve returning to the surface. Papyrus was watching his commander carefully, tense. That just worried Frisk more. If a fight broke out, they were pretty sure the weirdly gentle bomber wouldn't win. Undine stopped pacing, seeming to come to a decision. I hate to do this, Papyrus, she said, crossing her arms, but I'm busting you back down to security detail. I just can't trust you topside, and you put everyone in danger today by bringing that thing down here. Thank God, Sans muttered, sighing in obvious relief. Papyrus slumped in his chair, but nodded his assent. Yes, Commander, I understand. What about me? Frisk signed under the tabletop, where only Papyrus could see. They didn't feel quite so crappy now, but they were still trapped underground with the, underground, and their only protector had just been demoted. Papyrus looked them over. It's going to take a little while for you to heal completely. Humans are more than monsters. Chin propped up on his hands, Sans chuckled. Easy, Florence, he said. He at least seemed in a much better mood now that his brother was grounded from the surface. Or you could just take me home, Frisk suggested. Or to a hospital. They'd have to walk all the way to the hospital if Papyrus took them home. It wasn't like they could just take the metro. No one at home would be able or inclined to give them a ride either. What's that? Undine leaned on the table, looming over Frisk. What's it saying? Why is it being so sneaky? She was close enough that Frisk could smell sushi? The fluorescent light gleamed off her scales and jagged teeth. Frisk edged closer to Papyrus. They weren't really scared of him anymore. He might have bombed the metro station and taken them prisoner, but compared to Undine, he was Frisk's new best friend. They said they wanted to go home, as any child might, Papyrus said, curling an arm around Frisk's shoulders. And I imagine you're frightening them, so they're trying to avoid your attention. Frisk huddled deeper into their borrowed jacket. Their new best friend had the right idea, at least. Whether he could actually protect Frisk from his boss was up for debate. Tuh, Undine sneered, but sat back down. Anyone gonna be looking for you, kid? Frisk had seen enough spy movies to know nothing good ever happened after something like that got said. They burrowed closer into Papyrus's side. Yeah, Sans piped up from his side of the table, sleepy-eyed. That's gonna make it less scared. Papyrus frowned. Sans has a point, Commander. I don't care, Undyne snapped, cracking her knuckles. Answer the question, human. Without knowing what time it was, Frisk couldn't be sure. School could still be in, though the school would have called home by now, surely. If anyone picked up the phone, or cared that Frisk hadn't made it to school. Frisk lowered their head, glum. I don't think so. It might have been smarter to lie, but in the moment Frisk couldn't muster the effort to pretend anyone knew or cared where they were. Both skeletons frowned. Papyrus gave them a half hug. Wow, Sans said. Humans suck. Undyne wasn't quite as sympathetic. I take it the answer is no? Good. Undyne? Papyrus bristled at his boss's lack of tact. We need time to figure out how to handle this, Undyne said, gesturing at Frisk. The longer it takes any other humans to miss it, the better for us. Frisk perked up, just a little. They might have been grasping at straws, but they hoped that meant Undyne planned to keep them alive. On the other hand, it didn't sound like she intended to let Frisk go either. No hurry in that case, Frisk signed with a little huff of air. This was officially the worst day ever. At least it wasn't the last day ever. And they wouldn't have to take that math test today either. So they guessed that was something. Silver lining. Now, Undyne said, peering suspiciously at Frisk's hands. What to do with it in the meantime? Sans drummed his fingers on the table. Sharp ringing clicks. Might be able to clear out a storage closet. Toss some blankets in there or something. Sans? What? Sans shrugged, waving his brother off. Like our bunks are comfortable. The floor won't be so bad. Sitting on the cold, damp floor of a makeshift dungeon sounded pretty bad to Frisk, but no one was asking them. Papyrus tutted. If you wouldn't do it to a dog, you shouldn't do it to a human. Oh, he said, snapping his fingers with a sharp click. I have the best idea! Undyne and Sans exchanged a wary glance. Frisk watched Papyrus, expectant. Anything would be better than getting locked up in a closet alone. Why not put them on security detail with me? Papyrus smiled, obviously impressed with his great idea. The others didn't seem to share his enthusiasm. You want to give a captive human access to our security systems, Undyne said, voice flat. Did I hear that correctly? Do I need to have the Queen check you for head injuries? Papyrus shook his head. No, thank you. My head is fine. He leaned forward, undeterred by the dig that might have gone clear over his head. This is a good idea. I could use a helper and Sans is busy guarding the entrance. The human would be supervised all the time, and they'd have something to wear them out and keep them docile. He reached out to ruffle Frisk's hair. Right? You want to help dismantle the oppressive human power structure too, don't you? It'll be fun! To Frisk's surprise, Undyne didn't blow off Papyrus's stupid idea right away. Instead, she hummed thoughtfully. I don't know if I like the thought of a human running around the base learning about our security measures. I really don't like it, Sans chimed in, giving Frisk an ugly look across the table. Jerk, Frisk signed. Sans glowered. You're a jerk. Human, Undyne said, drawing Frisk's attention. I think you know what I'd prefer to do about you, but I don't need the silent treatment from that doofus over there. She pointed to Papyrus. So I'll leave it up to you. You want to hang out in a cell or work for Papyrus? Think about your answer. she warned, snarling. Because if you put a foot wrong, you'll pay the price. Got it? Frisk nodded without hesitation. Their feet would be kept well under control. No worries there. And if those were their only two options, it was pretty clear which one was the better deal. Security work couldn't be that hard. They could pretend they were working at a really lousy mall or something. A mall with no child labor laws and no arcade. Besides, what exactly did they owe their fellow humans? Either they'd have something to occupy themselves with until they got rescued, or maybe this wouldn't turn out to be the worst day ever. Sans glared at the table, arms crossed, but didn't offer any more objections. They looked up at Papyrus, who was grinning down at them as though he already knew how they'd choose.
Do I get one of those posh hats?
Papyrus grinned wider. The poshiest hat! Well, that was fun. Now that I'm probably on every terror watch list in existence, let's stop here for this week. Next week I'll be digging into some of those creepypasta submissions I asked for a while back, as well as a cute little Flowerfell fanfiction I got submitted by someone who follows me on Tumblr. See you next week. Love ya.